evening. I want to welcome you once again to our study of the Bible for this year, the Word in a Year. So last week we continued our exploration of the historical books of the Bible by looking at the book of Judges. And this was another book that is marked by a transitional state in the leadership of the nation of Israel. No longer is Moses in charge, no longer is Joshua in charge, as we saw in the book of Joshua, but instead it's a series of judges whom God raises up, empowered by the Holy Spirit to lead the nation. Now, the nation of Israel, it's also marked in this book by a number of up and down cycles that we find throughout the judges themselves. And there are not only a number of notable judges, but there are also a number of flawed judges as well. Some of these judges we know because of their flaws. This up and down behavior, it coincides with the way that the nation of Israel itself worships Yahweh throughout this entire period of the judges that we find in this book. There's a constant turning to the gods of the surrounding nations and then turning back towards Yahweh. We find this cyclical behavior throughout this entire book. It goes back and forth, back and forth. So in the middle of this climate in the nation of Israel, in this time period of the nation of Israel, we encounter the story that's found in the book of Ruth. And this is a really short, it's a really small book. So if you aren't necessarily reading along with us through our study of the Bible this year, maybe take some time this week and read through these short 4 chapters sometime that you have an opportunity this week. This is a seemingly insignificant work, yet there are a number of important takeaways that we can find throughout this book. And this book is easily broken down by each chapter, each of the 4 chapters that we find that are contained within this book. So the first is the introduction to the book, from Naomi to Mara. The second is Ruth gathers in Boaz's field. The third is Ruth proposes to Boaz. And then the fourth is Naomi's line is redeemed. So like I've said, this book is rooted in the time of the judges. The beginning of the book, it tells us that it occurs in the time period of the judges ruling Israel. So we know that's when the time period of this is all set up. We also know that this was this up and down cycle of serving God and turning away from God at this point of Israel's history. And because they turned away from God, there were times when God then in turn punished the nation for their disobedience. And Israel was required to keep their covenant with Yahweh. And there were blessings for following it, and then there were also curses for disobeying it. And the opening chapter tells us that there was a famine in the land of Israel. So it's likely that since they were disobedient, there was a curse, most likely occurred on the land in the form of a famine. In Deuteronomy, God promised the nation that if they obeyed the law, there would be plenty in the land. So a lack in the land indicates that there was disobedience involved with the nation of Israel. So the time of the judges and also a famine are the background for the opening of this entire book. So we're introduced to a family which is the central part of this book. And this family is one Elimelech and Naomi. And they lived in Bethlehem, but because of the famine that was on the land, they decided to leave Israel completely and go to this nation called Moab. Now Bethlehem, the name Bethlehem, it literally means a house of bread. So it's a bit ironic that the house of bread had no bread at all. So this family, they go to Moab, and there the 2 sons of the family, they marry Moabite women, Orpah and then Ruth. And there's a lot to unpack here, but I want to try to do a few things here. First, Elimelech's family was heading in the wrong direction. They headed west out of the promised land into this pagan nation. They headed back in the wilderness from which Israel originally came into the promised land. Secondly, his family, they married into a pagan nation by taking wives from the surrounding people. And this was a clear violation of the covenant of Yahweh. So this family, they're heading in the completely wrong direction. So while they're in Moab, tragedy strikes, and Elimelech, he dies. And then in turn, so do Naomi's 2 sons. So here's Naomi. She's left in this country, this foreign nation, this Moabite nation, with her 2 daughter-in-laws and no immediate family. So after some time, she hears that the famine has ended in Israel and that they can now return to their homeland. So she decides to go back to Bethlehem. Orpah and Ruth, they follow Naomi for a portion of this trip back into Bethlehem. And at some point along this trip, Naomi petitions them to return to Moab. She says, go back to where you came from. Go back to your family. And she reasons with them that she cannot provide for them the husbands to marry. That they should go back and find their own husbands in their own land. Go back to their own families' homes. So in this emotional gathering, they all weep and they cry over the situation. But it's in this moment that Orpah kisses her mother-in-law, Naomi, goodbye. But Ruth clings to her. You see, Ruth made a decision. She decided in that moment that she was going to go with Naomi wherever she went. Whether it took her away from her home and into a foreign land or not, she was going with Naomi. Nothing that Naomi could say could keep Ruth away from following after her. Naomi's God would be her God. Her people would be her people. So they go back to Bethlehem, and everyone gathers to greet them when they arrived and welcome her by name. They say, "Isn't this Naomi?" And Naomi says that rather than calling her Naomi, they should call her instead Mara. You see, the name Naomi, it means pleasant, but the name Mara means bitter. So right now, Naomi is very bitter. Naomi had so many things go awry that she wanted people to call her bitter rather than pleasant. Bitter rather than blessed, if you will. So this is the transition that we find at the beginning of the book of Ruth. We find that Naomi becomes Mara, but they return back to Israel during the barley harvesting season, which sets up the transition to the next portion of this book. So in an act of divine providence, we find in chapter 2 that Ruth gleans wheat in a man named Boaz's field. And this isn't by circumstance, but this is by divine providence. The law, you see, it commanded that a portion of grain be left for those who were in need, to be able to glean from those fields of those who had much. So there was a bit of a social provision clause, so to speak, found in the law for those who were less fortunate. It provided a way for them to obtain food in a scarcity when they had no money. So in this chapter, we're introduced to Boaz. And the Bible says that he's a man of great wealth and stature in Bethlehem. And he's also a kinsman of Naomi. So as Ruth gleans in Boaz's field, he takes notice of her. And he asks the supervisors of the field about Ruth. And they tell about the wonderful job that she does and how efficient, how hardworking she is, how she takes her duty seriously when it comes to gleaning these fields. And this leads to a bit of a courting, if you will, between Ruth and also Boaz. And because Ruth finds favor with Boaz, he allows her additional favors with respect to the gleaning of the fields. So Ruth returns home to tell Naomi, all about her day. And Naomi tells Ruth to continue gleaning in Boaz's field because he was generous and he's also a kinsman. And the favor that she finds with Boaz plays into the next part of the book, along with him being a kinsman. So the third section of the book is a proposal of sorts between Ruth and Boaz. You see, because Boaz is a kinsman to Naomi, he's able to exercise the right of kinsman redeemer. In Hebrew, it's called a goel. So this goel had a special role in ancient Israel. There were several important key aspects to it. They were responsible for buying fellow Israelites out of slavery. They were responsible for buying back family land that had been forfeited. And also for carrying on the family name by marrying a childless widow. So in a sense, they were responsible for safeguarding the family person, the property, and also the posterity. So it's under this last point that Naomi expects Boaz to carry out his role. See, Ruth is a childless widow. So by carrying out this final act, the family line would continue. So Ruth approaches Boaz about this, and there's one snag in this whole plan, right? There's one individual who is closer to Naomi than he is. So this is all finalized in the last section of the book, where we find this other individual forfeiting his right to redeem Ruth, and Boaz stepping into this role in his stead. So Naomi's line is redeemed by Boaz as he marries Ruth, and they have a son who's named Obed. And in this final chapter, we find that Naomi comes full circle. She once was Naomi, then she was Mara, and now she comes full circle back to her name Naomi. She's pleasant, she's thankful, she's seen this child that has been born. And this child named Obed is worth a special mention because at the end of the book we find out he is the grandfather of David, someone who we're going to talk about greatly next week. So what are some important takeaways from this book? Well, the first is God's providence and mercy at work throughout this entire book. Even in the middle of disobedience, God moves throughout this book to bring good from bad situations. The second is God's ability to graft in those who are outside of Israel. Ruth was a Moabite from a pagan nation, yet we find her in chapter 1 calling Naomi's God her God and Naomi's people her people. So there's a grafting in of this Moabite not only into Israel, but also as a part of God's redemptive purposes on earth through Jesus. The third and the final part is the role of the kinsman redeemer. Boaz was a kinsman redeemer, a goel as we talked about earlier, to Ruth. And in a similar way, Jesus is our kinsman redeemer, redeeming us by becoming like us and reconciling us to God. So that wraps us up for the book of Ruth for this week. And next week, we're going to go into and cover 1st and 2nd Samuel. I hope you have a great week.